Okay, so this is my entry into the Scrimba Weekly Web Dev Challenge. For those of you that don't know, each week Scrimba gives out a challenge. This week, the challenge was to create a countdown timer. I've styled mine as a NASA launch control countdown. You're free to do pretty much whatever you want. So I just want to look quickly at how we can use animation specifically when we are using styled components in React. So I've built this app here using React styled components, just because that's a course that I've recently been studying. And I wanted to just brighten up a little bit with some animation. And what I want to do is just take this little space shuttle that I've got down here, and let's just make that fly around a little bit. So adding animation to styled components is pretty straightforward. If you haven't done any style components before, basically what you need to know is that when you create a styled component in React, what you do is you import styled from styled components. This is the dependency that you need to use styled components. And then you set up each individual part of the component as its own elements. So I've got an element here that I've called flight. And all flight is doing at the moment is holding the CSS to display the image of the space shuttle. So what you do then is you set up the const, you give it a name, and then you set it equal to styled, which you've imported from style components, and then whatever element it is you want, an H1, a P tag, section, or whatever. In this case, it's a div. So I've styled this div, and I've set up the CSS inside the backticks. And that's basically what styled components are. You've got backticks, which hold basically normal CSS, except it's not quite normal. There are a few differences, and there are a few things we need to know. So how can we animate this little spaceship here? Well, the first thing we need to do is bring in a named component from style components, and it is called keyframes. So that tells you that we're going to use keyframes just like you would use keyframes in normal CSS. How we use keyframes, though, is a little bit different. So the next thing that I need to do is set up my keyframes. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to create a const, and I'm going to call it rotate. And rotate, I am going to set equals to keyframes. And we don't need to specify here like div or h1 or anything like that, but we do need the backticks. Now, inside the backticks, you can write some CSS. So for this rotate, I'm just going to go for a pretty straightforward from and to with a transform on it. So we're going to say, so we've got our from in curly braces, we've got our to, and inside here we can have transform. And I am going to set this to transform as a rotate and 90 degrees. And sorry, no, 90 degrees is where it's going to end up. I'm going to set that as transform 0 degrees. So that's where it's going from. And then we can just cut and paste that in there. 90 degrees. Okay. I'm going to set up another animation actually as well. So we want the rocket just to fly around a little bit. So let's call this one fly. And I'm going to do this one slightly differently. So we're going to say const fly, same setup, equals keyframes, open the backtick. Here I'm going to use the percentages. That might well also be something you're aware of in CSS. So let's just have a left 0. I might just copy that down a few times. So if we start off with left 0 pixels and we go to 450 pixels and then back to 0 pixels. And in the meantime, I think we want to rotate it one more time. So we should do a transform rotate 720. I can just be really, really lazy and copy the CSS from the above one. I'm going to put that there. So you can see it's at home, it goes out, it rotates, it comes back. Really straightforward. I just want that to be a 720. And then we just need to think about percentages. So we've got 400% divided by 4 gives us, well, a 0%, 25%, 50%, and a 100%. That doesn't quite make sense, does it? So let's change that to 50 and 75. Yeah, I think that makes more sense because it's going to go out, turn round, and then the same time it took it to go out will be the time it takes it to get home. So does that make sense? Sort of. Let's see how it looks. Right, we're not quite done. How do we actually implement that? Well, let's just come a bit further down in the component. So here in the image tag, I've just left some asterisks here. So when we want to get some variables into a styled component in React, all we need to do is, well, the clue's right here, really, in the backticks. These are just sort of template literal strings. So all we need to do, let's get rid of those, is open up some curly braces, start them with a $sign, and as you can see, that turns white, and that means we are in. So in here, you can do some JavaScript. Maybe you want to conditionally render something. Maybe you want to link it to state. That's all doable. But in this case, all I'm going to do is call in the two that we did, that we just made. So the first one was called, God, my memory's bad. The first one was called rotate. The second one was called fly. So let's stick rotate in there. 1 second. And then fly. And as you can see, all we're doing is continuing the CSS straight afterwards. So it's bringing in that for 1 second. It's bringing in the second one for 4 seconds. The CSS just continues. If you've used some keyframes animation in CSS before, you know, you've got everything at your fingertips just in exactly the same way, really. If we give this a save, let's see what happens. Oh, and the spaceship is flying around and spinning around. It's actually spinning around a little bit more than I wanted, but you get the idea. Let's just double check that with a refresh. I think what I might have intended to do actually is put, let's try that. Is that better? No, I think I preferred it before. A lot of spinning going on. I'm not quite sure that I've got that spinning as I intended. Let's just double check what we're doing here. So we're transforming on the rotate from 0 to 90 degrees. That's fine. Oh, look, I put it to rotate 720, not 270, of course. That's what's making it do something a bit weird. That's a bit more like it. So it just comes in and stops. It's a slightly odd beginning. It might need a bit of tidying up. So it flies out, comes in, spins around, stops. We're going to leave it like that for now. Now, if we just continue, I'll just show you something else on this app. I'm just going to set countdown. So we're going to just give it, let's just give it 4 seconds. So we get taken to a new page. As it counts down, the fuel is emptying, it's fueling up, and then blast off. So I've got more animation going on there. Let's just check that again. So I'll give it a little bit longer. So the fuel is full. As we count down, the fuel is empty as it's pumped into the shuttle. Get down to 0, blast off, and the arm, the fueling arm, spins round. So we've got a little bit more animation there. And I'm just going to show you that quickly. And that works in exactly the same way, we've brought in keyframes. We've set up the rotations and the movements that we wanted. So here's the rotation, and that rotation there is just the fueling arm spinning round. And then we've got the launch here, so that goes from bottom 0 to bottom 1000 pixels, i.e. off the top of the screen, in one kind of speedy movement. However, what we have done is we've set those to happen right at the end of the countdown. And we've been a little bit clever using some props to do that. And I'm just going to show you what I did very quickly. So if we go into the main timer app, what's happening is that when the timer counts down, we've got all sorts of states looking after the business logic of the timer, which is fine. However, the important ones to think about here are finished and set finished. So when this changes to finished, either the counter gets to 0, the state is updated, finished becomes true. So it moves from false to true. Let's see what happens to the rocket when that becomes true. Here we are. So inside this bit of JavaScript here then, what we've done is we've used the $ and the curly braces to open up the potential for JavaScript, put in an arrow function. That arrow function takes in this finished prop. So we've sent that down as props. And then it just does a quick if. If finished is true, return launch, else return null. And what you'll see is that we're right here within the animation section of the CSS. So that's just like saying, for the whole beginning of the app, the animation is null. And then when that gets to 0, finished becomes true, that flips to launch, and animation launch does animation launch up here that we've imported with the keyframes. Exactly the same thing happens with the rotate. So all that really is, we're going from timer, we've got this finished state here. If we scroll right down to the bottom, that's going to show us the props. There's plenty going on with this app, but here we've got the styled rocket. And if I move the browser out of the way, we've got the styled rocket, countdown timer, total, finished. So that's the finished prop we're passing down. And then in that style, we've got the 2 keyframes there. And when finished is reached, that launches. The other animation you might have noticed is actually not CSS keyframes. And that is, if I just start it again, that's this fuel which goes down with the timer. That's not a keyframes animation. That is actually 2 divs, one on top of the other. And the div height is adjusted depending on state. So again, it is a styled component. And we're doing quite a similar thing. If I come down to the fuel tank and fuel, here we are. So this is it. This is the fuel element. What we're bringing in is, again, an arrow function. We've got 2 props in there that have come down. One is the total amount of time, and the other is the countdown. So what we can do, so if the user puts in, say, 5 minutes, that will be the total, and then countdown will be 4:59, 4:58, 4:57, etc. And then here, a bit of logic just figures out what the percentages of that is, and then it returns this pixel count variable, and that pixel count, or sorry, it sets a pixel count variable, doesn't return it, and that pixel count variable is just figuring out how high you want the fuel div to be. So when 50% of time has gone, 50% of the fuel has been pumped into the shuttle, and that means that this this whole div here is getting whiter and whiter as that fuel level drops. So if we just restart that, so we set it for 10 seconds, and then as the counter starts, there's a bit of a delay, 9, 8, 7, it's just going to move down in increments, each one worth 10%. And that would be exactly the same. If you set it for 5 hours, then it would take 5 hours to empty. So I just tell you that just to make the point really easy to get some JavaScript in here or to animate it with some CSS. And I think that's about it. Thank you very much for listening.